Hi everybody. The topic of the shiur tonight is called "Would the Real Adar Please Stand Up?" Those of you who are my age or older will remember a show called "What's My Line?" Right? So we had to guess what the person does for a living, and then would the real so and so please stand up, right? So would the real Adar please stand up? Because one of them is an imposter. One of them is an imposter Adar in a leap year, and the other one is the real Adar. What do I mean by that? We're going to see. So let's take a look at two opposing halachas in Shulchan Aruch. The first halacha is from Siman Nun Hey, and by the way, there's a lot of Torah on a leap year when there's two Adars. Any bar mitzvah boy who has his bar mitzvah in a leap year, his bar mitzvah pshetel is invariably about putting on tefillin and chiyuv and mitzvahs and all these other things. But what?
And yurtzeit.
And yurtzeit. So we're going to see a contradiction in halacha. So the Shulchan Aruch writes in Siman Nun Hey, to determine the age of when you can count someone as part of a minyan, it says Imnar echad nolad b'chavtes la'adar rishon mishana meuberes. If one young man was born on the 29th of Adar Rishon in a leap year, V'nar echad nolad ba'adar sheni be'echad bo, and another young man was born a couple days later in the first of Adar Sheni, so then Ushnas Yud Gimel Eina Meuberes, and the 13th year, the bar mitzvah year of these two boys is a regular year. Also, Shenolad b'chavtes la'adar, harishon tzarich lahamtin ad chavtes la'adar. Also, Shenolad b'chavtes la'adar, harishon tzarich lahamtin ad chavtes la'adar. So the one that was born on the 29th of Adar Rishon has to wait until the 29th of regular Adar in the 13th year, and Lios ben Yud Gimel Shana to become bar mitzvah. Va'oso Shenolad acharav be'echad ba'adar hasheni, yihiyeh ben Yud Gimel Shana, and the one that was born on the first of Adar Sheni, his bar mitzvah will be on the first of Adar. So you have a bit of a paradox. Chronologically, one boy was born several weeks before the other, but the bar mitzvahs, one boy will become bar mitzvah several weeks before they'll switch places, will reverse, right? So the one that was born on the first of Adar Sheni will have his bar mitzvah before, and the person who was born on the 29th of Adar Rishon will have his bar mitzvah at the end of the month. Strange paradox, right? Okay, but we can be masik such a thing. Okay? Now, take a look at the Ramah. And I should have italicized this Ramah. Umi shenolad ba'adar v'na'aseh bar mitzvah b'shnas ha'ibur. But if someone was born in a regular Adar, and then his bar mitzvah falls out in a leap year, so when is that person's bar mitzvah? Eino nasa bar mitzvah Adar Hasheni. His bar mitzvah is in the second Adar, not in the first Adar. So that would be an indication. You would say, well, that's logical. I mean, after all, Purim is in the second Adar, so that indicates to us that the real Adar, the one that really counts as Adar, is the second Adar. Okay, so far we're consistent with what we know to be the reality. Now let's look in the most common question that a rabbi gets during a Jewish leap year, which is, Rabbi, I have Yortzeit and Adar. When do I say Kaddish? When do I light my Yortzeit candle? Okay, the most common question. Anyone who has Yortzeit and Adar will invariably ask this question at some point in their lives, because we forget from year to year. And I forget even from year to year. I got to look up the halacha all the time. I always forget too. So anyway, let's take a look at the two places in the Shulchan Aruch where this is addressed, and we'll see that it's a machlokas. So the Mechaber in Siman Tav Kuf Sameches, which is in Laws of Fasting, Hilchas Tainus, he says as follows: Kisheira Yom Shemeis Avivo Imo Ba'adar V'Shana Muberes. When the yahrzeit of a person's parents falls out in Adar in a leap year, Yis'aneh Ba'adar Sheni, he should fast on the second Adar. Now this is following the very strong tradition that people fast on the yahrzeit of a parent. Not everyone does this anymore, but for those who do, it's considered to be a minhag Yisrael. It's not halachically binding if a person doesn't accept it upon oneself, but it is a very strong minhag, and therefore the Shulchan Aruch discusses it. If you want to know which Adar to fast, you should fast in the second Adar. Very consistent with what the Shulchan Aruch has said above, right, for a bar mitzvah. Now comes along the Ramah and throws a whole wrench into it. V'yesh omrim diyisana barishon. Some say that you should fast in the first Adar, not in the second Adar. What's going on here? Imlo shemeis b'shnas ha'ibor ba'adar sheni. Unless when the person passed away, when the parents passed away, he passed away in an Adar sheni because he passed away in a leap year. So then, then if the yortzeit is in a leap year, then you fast in Adar sheni. But and the minhag taka is to go like the Maharimins and the Maharil that the Ramah is quoting. But he quotes the Maharil as saying that some have a minhag to fast in both. So when someone comes to me and asks me what's the halacha, I smile and I tell them it's a three-way machlokas, 3 different customs. The Machaber says you should fast or you should say Kaddish observe the yortzeit in the second Adar. The Ramah says you should observe yortzeit in the first Adar, and he also says that some have a custom to do it in both. So choose which one you like. Obviously, if it's a machlokas between the Machaber and the Ramah, we would tell you to go like the Ramah, that's minhag Ashkenaz. However, there's nothing wrong, especially because we're not telling people to fast, but we're telling them to say Kaddish. We're telling them to light a yortzeit candle. We're telling them perhaps to lead the davening. Now here's one important thing that the poskim do point out, and it's very important that you know this. I believe the Mishnah Berurah says this as well, that we go like the Ramah, that you have yortzeit in the first Adar, you want to observe it in the second Adar, geges und heit, but you cannot displace another chiyuv in the second Adar. I mean, look, you want to be machmir, but not in the other guy's places, right? So therefore, you have to defer. Someone else wants to daven, or even if someone else is an avelis, you can't take someone else's chiyuv because you want to be machmir in the second Adar as well. Okay, so far so good. And also it would go with an aliyah also. I want the Haftorah twice. I want the Haftorah twice this year, right? Right? So the Gabbai has to know that just because a guy wants it doesn't mean he's entitled to it. And we see the same halacha brought down by the Ramah in Hilchas Avelus in Yoredeya. He says in Siman Taf Beis, V'imesu ba'adar v'nisabra hashana, ha'ikar lihisanos ba'adar harishon, af al pi sheyesh cholkin kachu ikar. And the Ramah says the same thing. And I want you to know that he's quoting consistently. He quotes the Trumas Hadeshen, he quotes the Maharil in Orach Chaim, and he quotes this posek called the Mahari Mintz. The Mahari Mintz, Rabbi Yehuda Mintz, lived a very long life. According to some accounts, he lived for 100 years, born in the early 1400s, dies in the early 1500s, and he was a prolific posek in correspondence with many different poskim. But unfortunately, a number of his written psakim were lost. We only have 16 extant responsa of the Mahari Mintz, and they were recorded or sort of kept in posterity by his granddaughter's husband, who was the Maharam Padua. And that's how we have the psakim of the Mahari Mintz. Fine. So I want to go through one of the psakim of the Mahari Mintz, where he goes through this and he tells us why in the world would he say that for a bar mitzvah, the bar mitzvah is in Adar Sheni, which seems to indicate that the real Adar is Adar Sheni, but when it comes to yortzeit, the correct time for yortzeit is Adar Rishon. So first of all, it would seem from all other indicators, or let's say from other, I shouldn't say all other, the Gemara in the Darim has an interesting discussion. What do you write on a shtar? Which I didn't copy for you. What do you write in a shtar in a leap year when you want to demarcate the date? So the Gemara's maskana is that for the first Adar you just write Adar Stam, and for the second Adar you write Adar Sheni. We don't really paskin that way. In a Ksuva we write Adar HaRishon versus Adar HaSheni, but the maskana of the Gemara is you write Adar Stam for the first Adar and Adar HaSheni for the second Adar. And that seems to indicate that there's some Adarness to the first Adar too. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. But we have other indications. I mean, look at, after all, Purim is in Adar Sheni. I mean, if you want to take a look at the primary source of the Gemara about the idea of Purim being an Adar Sheni, it's really sources 5 and 6. And I think that will provide you with some background material here, but just to put it in context of Purim. The Gemara, the Mishnah says in Megillah Daf Vavim at Beis, Karuas HaMegillah Ba'adar Harishon Lisabra Hashana Korinosa Ba'adar Sheni. If you read the Megillah in the first Adar, and then the Beis Din makes an announcement that really this year is going to be a leap year, so there is an Adar Sheni. Sometimes the Beis Din didn't do it until the very last minute. They have until the end of Adar to declare another Adar. So if that's the case, then you have to read it again in Adar Sheni. Ein ben Adar Harishon l'Adar Hasheni ela kriyas hamegillah umatanos la'avyonim. And this is really the only difference, and the Gemara qualifies that statement. There actually is more. It's really all the mitzvahs of Purim apply in the second Adar and not in the first Adar. If you take a look at the Gemara on Vavim at Beis, the Gemara says, Tanya Karuas HaMegillah Ba'adar Harishon L'Nisabra Hashana Korinosa Ba'adar Hasheni Shekol Mitzvahs Shenogos B'Sheni Noagos B'Rishon Chutz V'Mikra Megillah. All mitzvahs that apply in the first apply in the second, except for reciting the Megillah. We're not going to contend with that shita of the Tanna Kama for now. We're just going to look at the next two shitas. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi Omer Ein Korinosa Ba'adar Sheni Shekol Mitzvah Shenogos B'Sheni Noagos B'Rishon. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi has an interesting shita. He says no. If you read the Megillah in Adar Rishon, don't read it in Adar Sheni. He says because anything that you can do in the second Adar, you can do in the first Adar. He says they're just as good as they're equally Adar. They have equal Adarness to each other. They're just as good. But Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer Mishum Rabbi Yossi Af Korinosa Ba'adar Hasheni Shekol Mitzvah Shenogos B'Sheni Ein Nohagos B'Rishon. And he says no, and that's how we paskin. We paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and we say that you can only do it in Adar Sheni. That really Adar Sheni is the real Adar, vis-a-vis Purim at least. So the Gemara now says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Ushneha Mikra Echad Darshu. That both Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who disagree with each other, base their respective opinions on the same pasuk. It says, B'chol Shana V'Shana. So, it says in the Megillah, every year you're supposed to read the Megillah. You're supposed to do this mitzvah of Purim, B'chol Shana V'Shana. So Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, Sover B'chol Shana V'Shana, Ma Kol Shana V'Shana Adar Hasamuch Lishvat, Afkan Adar Hasamuch Lishvat. So he says regular years, when Adar comes immediately after Shvat. So therefore, Lein the Megillah in the month that is immediately after Shvat, which is Adar Rishon.
You can also say it comes immediately before Nisan.
So there comes Simeon quotes from Shimon Gamliel Sover B'chol Shana V'Shana, Ma Kol Shana V'Shana Adar Hasamuch LeNisan, Afkan Adar Hasamuch LeNisan. So that's Rav Shimon Gamliel's opinion. He says no, every year Adar is adjacent to Nisan, so that's when you should lane the Megillah and do the mitzvahs of Purim. Obviously, there's greater depth in this Gemara that has to be plumbed. We don't have time. We're not going to go into the details of this machlokus. But now you look at the next statement. The Gemara says, "Bishlam Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi mistaber taima de'ein mavirin ala mitzvahs." Ela Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel my taima. So the Gemara now says, I understand Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi. He says, look, I have two ways of looking at the pasuk of B'chol Shana V'Shana. It's either the Adar that's closer to Shvat or it's the Adar that's closer to Nisan. What's going to tip the scales in my favor? Ein mavirin ala mitzvahs. You're not supposed to pass over a mitzvah. If you have a mitzvah to do it at the first available opportunity. So if Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni are equally viable, so then do it in Adar Rishon. But Ela Rav Shimon Gamliel my time, what's his reasoning? Amar Rebbe Tabi, time of the Rav Shimon Gamliel, mismach geula legeula, and he says there's a factor of trying to create an adjacency between one redemption and another redemption. And Rashi says that means connecting Purim to Pesach. They both represent the redemption or the salvation of the Jewish people, and that's adif, and that's more important. Rabbi Lazar Omar, time of the Shimon Gamliel mehacha dechsiv lekayem es igeres hapurim hazos hashenis. The pasuk says to fulfill this writ of Purim a second time, and the word hashenis could also be read as Adar Sheni, the second Adar. Bottom line is that I think that you see from this Gemara that there's a certain intrinsic quality to the month that precedes Nisan as being a month of Geula. And that's why there's a compelling argument to make sure that the real Adar is the month that's adjacent to Nisan. On a metaphysical level, although, we don't necessarily have to subscribe to this, the Arizal used to say that just like you need the month of Elul as a month of preparation for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and the high holidays, you need the month of Adar as a preparatory month for Chodesh Nisan, for the Chodesh HaGeula. So perhaps there's some aspect of this in this Gemara over here. Mismach Geula leGeula Adif. Okay? So there seems to be something intrinsic to that month, that the last month of the year should be adjacent to Nisan. And therefore it would turn out that if we need to add an extra month, what is the extra month that we're shtupping in there is not the last month of the year. The last month of the year is the real Adar, and the extra month that we have to add in is the Adar Rishon. Okay, let's keep that in mind, please, because that's important to understand the Maharimins. So let's go back to source number 4. Now, the tshuva, the original tshuva, the Maharimins, is about 3 to 4 times of what you have in front of you. I pared it down quite significantly. So I would recommend that if you are interested in researching this further, then it's certainly worth your while to go through the original. But he says as follows. His questioner is, Asher sha'alta amiti yedidi yedid, harav ha'aluf hareb Menachem Rapa Katz, al odos bincha hayanik v'chakim hayakar, hacharash, maybe Mishalem Kizi Rapa Katz, Meshulam Kizi Rapa Katz. I'm not sure all of these appellations to your wonderful little boy chick, Meshulam Kizi, Asher Nolad, I don't even know what kind of name Kizi is, Asher Nolad B'Shana Pshuta Ba'adar. He was born, your son, Rabbi Rafa Katz, your son was born in a regular Adar. V'yihya bar mitzvah b'shana me'uberes. Ma'yihya mishpat hanaru ma'asehu lihiyos gadol min haTorah. So what do you say? What's going to be the halacha about this child? When does he become a gadol? Me'eza chodesh maninan lei. O me Adar harishon, o me Adar hasheni. Do we count from the first Adar or the second Adar? Ata ahuvi ha'aluf, my beloved friend. His kartani, you reminded me. V'teida gam kavot torasa harei kamo arboim shana sha'alani avicha zekenecha ha'aluf ma'arena Rab Meshulam Kuzi zal derech chida. I remember now that now I think what he says is avicha zekenecha, I think he's talking about his grandfather, but I could be mistaken. Because zekenecha usually means your grandfather. But he says either your father or your grandfather asked me this question 40 years ago. And he asked me a riddle. He asked it to me in a riddle. And his riddle was, Eich nimsa, how could we ever find, Reuven nolad kodem Shimon, that Reuven is born before Shimon, the Shimon yihiyeh bar mitzvah kodem Reuven, and Shimon will be bar mitzvah before Reuven. That was the riddle that your father or your grandfather asked me. Kama yomin, for many days before. In other words, Shimon is younger than Reuven by many days, but his bar mitzvah will be many days before Reuven's. And Vuvu, and the answer to that riddle is, Sheruven nolad b'sof Adar harishon, v'Shimon nolad b'tchilas Adar hasheni. So the Ramah, as you know, quoted this. The answer to the riddle is that Reuven is born at the end of the first Adar, Shimon is born at the beginning of the second Adar, v'hashana shel yud gimel yihiyeh shana pishuta. And the bar mitzvah year there's only one Adar. V'imkein Shimon shenolad ba'Adar hasheni yeh bar mitzvah le'echad ba'Adar, v'Reuven shenol b'chavtes la'Adar rishon yeh bar mitzvah le'chavtes ba'Adar, dahainu chavches yamim achar Shimon. So he'll be bar mitzvah 28 days. Reuven will be bar mitzvah 28 days after Shimon, even though he was born 28 days before Shimon. Okay? So, you see, at least from the way that the riddle is posed, that this was a question that had been circulating, but the way that his father had posed the issue was in the opposite case. Here he's asking that the kid was born in a regular Adar, and the year of the bar mitzvah is a leap year. The original riddle was when the children were born in a leap year and the bar mitzvah was in a regular year. So he says in response, and I'm skipping several lines, he says, V'chein ze nirli davar pashut, im echad nolad ba'adar rishon, ve'echad ba'adar sheni, that it seems very clear to me that if one child was born in the first Adar and the other one was born in the second Adar, uvishna shalosh esrei yegam kein ibur, and in the bar mitzvah year it's also a leap year, which could very easily happen. Az vadai hayinu omrim hanolad birishon yiyeh bar mitzvah ba'adar harishon, ba'sheni ba'sheni. Then we would surely say that the one that was born in Adar Rishon would have his bar mitzvah first in Adar Rishon. We don't say that because the real Adar is Adar Sheni that everyone gets pushed to the second Adar. And each boy will have his bar mitzvah in his respective month. We do not say, even though the Magen Avram intimates not this way, but we do not say, says the Marimis, that we would say that both kids have their bar mitzvah in the leap month of Adar Sheni. But rather, if you were born in Adar Rishon, your bar mitzvah and the bar mitzvah year is a leap year, so your bar mitzvah is in Adar Rishon. El Amrina Mishanolad b'chodesh ha'ibur nismala sa'asu shnasu b'chodesh ha'ibur. U'mishanolad b'chodesh ha'pashat nismala sa'asu shnasu b'chodesh ha'pashat. So he just wants to clarify that that's clear. You're born in a leap year and your bar mitzvah is in a leap year. Whatever month you were born in, that's when your bar mitzvah is in. But now let's go back to our question. Well, ye'inyan she'oltin nirali de'yihye bar mitzvah ba'adar hasheni. But in our case, where you're born in a regular year, it would seem very clear to me that your bar mitzvah is in the second Adar. The nisabra hashana nisabra lo. That when the year becomes a leap year, it becomes a leap year for the boy, meaning that he has to go, his age is commensurate to the leap year's criteria. And then it turns out that he will have gone through 5 leap years over his 13-year life, because there's a certain pattern of 7 out of every 19 years are leap years, so on average 5 out of every 13 years will be leap years. Kinimsa b'tshuva b'zelashono, and I don't know who he's quoting in this tshuva. Maybe he's quoting the Maharil, I'm not sure. Al esek hana'ar shehigia liyud gimel shana im chodesh ha'ibur bichlal. So in this tshuva, he says, do we count the leap year as part of his aging process? Nirali devadai eno min haminya. It would seem to me that the answerer responds that you can't count that as part of his 12-month periods. No, that doesn't count. You have to wait until the following month, until Adar Sheni. And the tshuva brings a proof from the Yerushalmi, from the Talmud Yerushalmi, which states as follows. The mehiru simonim v'ichur simonim, that the precociousness of one producing puberty, whether we're talking about a boy or a girl, v'ichur simonim, u'shlosha shanim shel besula, or the 3 years of a besula. Now what does he mean by that? The Gemara states that if a girl is under the age of 3 and she loses her virginity, which means the hymen ruptures, then halachically it will grow back if she's under the age of 3. And she still is rendered halachically a besula for certain halachic issues, like the ksuva, right? But if the hymen ruptures after the age of 3, so then she is not a besula anymore halachically. So the question is, what if one of those years, that from the date of birth till till her third birthday, is a leap year? You don't count, and we're dealing with physiology here. We're mixing medicine, right? We're mixing biology with halacha, and which is a fascinating combination here. So we're saying basically her body will conform to the Jewish calendar, and it will take an extra month for her to mature to the point where the hymen which ruptures will not repair itself, will not heal. Okay? And he explains, and this is from the Yerushalmi, he says, because teluyim be'ibor hachodesh shel hashana, because physical puberty and the issue with the hymen is based upon the Beis Din's declaration of leap years and what's not a leap year. Shenemar, and it's based on a pasuk, says the Yerushalmi, a pasuk in Tehillim that says, Ekra le'elokim elyon, lokel gomer alai, that I will call to my God up above, and he will be the one to complete me. Now what that means is, explains the tshuva, Perush gomer umaskim im beistin shalmata bi'iburam. That Hashem conforms to the calendar that is defined by the beistin down below. God will make my aging process conform to the Jewish calendar. Okay, you got that? The Ibru Hashana Bisuleha Chosrin, to the point where if a girl ruptures her hymen in Adar Rishon and her birthday is in Adar, those bisulim will grow back. They will heal. And that's for everything. And therefore, a boy who needs to be physically mature, which we assume has happened by his 13th birthday, that will not take place until Adar Sheni. Physiologically, he's still a katan until Adar Sheni. So now let's go on. We skipped a little bit more of the Marimitz. Now he wants to bring proof from Talmud Bavli. And he says, Uchahaikav ne'isanami b'talmud didan b'sof benos kusiyim amasnisim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Daya Chodsha. Now, in order to understand this very involved discussion about Nida, I'll just give it in like a 2-second introduction, or maybe a 20-second introduction. If a woman has an abnormal menstrual flow, she's called a zava. What I mean by abnormal is when, at a time when she's not expected to menstruate. It's during the period at the time of month when she's not expecting to have her flow, and she begins to flow. The halacha of the Mishnayos and Nida is that if she has a flow for 3 consecutive days, she's rendered a zava gedola, and she is tamei for 7 days, and she has to bring a carbon at the end of that 7-day period. Okay? Now, what happens if a woman starts flowing blood due to the fact that she's about to give birth? She's pregnant, and we know that in many times a woman starts to bleed when she's getting ready to deliver a baby. There could be some hemorrhaging. How do you determine for a pregnant woman whether the bleeding that she's experiencing is a result of ziva, meaning abnormal menstrual flow which will render her tamei, versus blood that is pre-birth blood, which does not render her tamei? So there's a machlokes in the Mishnah itself as to how many days before the actual birth can we assume that blood that she's seeing before the birth is considered to be pre-birth blood versus abnormal menstrual blood, or zava blood. And so Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, Daya Chodsha, 1 month before. 1 month before. Anytime, if it's 1 month before, anytime within that month before she gives birth, it's called pre-birth blood and she's not tamei. If it's before 30 days, so then it's considered to be zava blood and it will render her tamei. To the point where Rabbi Yehuda says that if she bled for 1 day, 31 days before, and then 2 days, 30 days before and 29 days before she gives birth, she's not rendered a zava, even though she bled for 3 consecutive days. Okay, that's the halacha of the Mishnah. Comes along the Gemara and says, Umaisi, I'm skipping the brackets, which was just a quote from the Bartanura, just to clarify what I just told you. So, Umaisi Allah b'Gemara Tani Rabbi Yuda Amar Mishum Rabbi Tarfon Daya Chadsha v'yesh b'davar lahakel ulahachmir ad da Amar Rav Adabar Ahava Shmamina Kesavar Rabbi Yuda Shipura Gorein. We see that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the shofar is the cause. Now, what does that mean? The shofar is the cause. So he says, Upirish Rashi Shipura Shofar Shetokin Bo Beistin B'Kiddush HaChodesh. So Rashi explains that the shofar that we blow to declare that it is the new month, so then that is the criterion of what determines her physiology. And the way Rashi explains is that once a woman reaches her 9th month, her halachic status changes. So even though we're dealing with a halachic status that is declared by perhaps Beistin, or perhaps is declared by a halachic reality, that changes her physiology. The bleeding itself is considered to be changed. whether or not you consider this as compelling of an argument as the previous statement from the Yerushalmi, the Maharim Mintz feels that this is a compelling argument. That if, let's say, the ninth month would start on Rosh Chodesh, so then it's the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Chodesh that creates a halachic distinction between the blood that she discharged before Rosh Chodesh and the blood that she discharges after Rosh Chodesh. Anyway, the Maharim Mintz wanted to bring this as another proof that sometimes God conforms to the halachic determinations of the Beis Din in their statements of when the calendar year is. Now he brings another proof, and we're skipping several more lines. He says, "Va'od nerali lahavi raya min hatos v'sof perakonam yain b'maseches nedarim." I want to bring another proof from Tosfos, where the Gemara I mentioned in Nedarim talks about when a person makes a neder about Adar. I won't eat in Adar. Does that apply to Adar Rishon? Does it apply to Adar Sheni? There are a number of permutations to this question. But Tosfos over there says, Chodesh ha'ibur Adar HaRishon hu v'lo Adar HaSheni. Tosfos states explicitly that you should know that the added month is the first Adar. The added month is not the second Adar, it's the first Adar. Teda, Shaharei Adar HaRishon Milamid Yom, Sheni Michavtes. And what's one of my proofs, says Tosfos? How many days is the first Adar? It's 30 days. How many days is the second Adar? 29 days. How many days is a standard Adar? 29 days. You'll see. It'll come up shortly. So that's proof. So Tosfos says, you see that the Adar Sheni is the same number of days as a standard Adar, so that proves that it's the second Adar that's the real Adar. Va'od the Megillah Purim b'Sheni. And furthermore, we see that the Megillah and the holiday of Purim is celebrated in the second Adar. Alma Rishon Chodesh Ha'ibur Ad Kan L'Shonim. So you see from Tosfos that the first Adar is the inserted month, the added month, but the real Adar is Adar Sheni. The Imke concludes the Maharim Mintz regarding a bar mitzvah boy. Kev in the Adar Harishon hu Vadei Chodesh Ha'ibur Misvara Yeshlanu Lomar. It would seem to make sense for us to say, and I'm skipping a whole chunk over here, V'chi bishvil kriyas shem shekarlo Adar nach nizeh lios bar onshin chas v'shalom. Should we argue, he's asking a rhetorical question, just because we call this added month Adar Rishon, is that enough of a reason for us to incriminate a little boy and say that we're going to give you lashes for eating chazer and Adar Rishon because it's already past your birthday? What right do we have to do that? What right do we have to hold him responsible just because this artificial Adar, this fake Adar, this so-called Adar, so to speak, has the same name as the real Adar? No, it's not the real Adar. So therefore, he says, "V'lo nomar nisabra hashana nisabra lo." We should instead say that if it's a leap year, the leap year benefits the bar mitzvah boy, and therefore he's not bar mitzvah until Adar Sheni. Halo kriyas Hashem lav mishum hachi asal mipnei she'adar hu chodesh ha'achron l'chodoshim nasnu lo zeh Hashem. Look at the Maharim Mintz's language. He says, this month is an imposter. It's really not an Adar. It's really not Adar. They needed to give it a name. So they figured the last month of the year is Adar, so we'll call this one Adar as well. So we'll have two Adars. But the real Adar, there's an Adarness to the month of Adar. That's Adar Sheni. Okay, let's go on. Because now the Maharim Mintz is going to throw a wrench, just like I told you the Ramah throws a wrench. He twists everything around now when he talks about Yortzeit. Now we skip again a number of lines. And now we go into this part where he talks about Yortzeit. So, Masha ani noheg laharos l'sho'alai al hata'anis miyom shenespo avivo imo im yis'anu ba'adar rishon o ba'adar sheni sheyis'anu ba'rishon. Whenever someone asks me a shaila about when should I fast for the Yortzeit of my parents, I always tell them to fast in the first Adar. Now, he's just got through saying that the first Adar is not really Adar. And yet, he comes along now and has the chutzpah to say, I tell people to fast in the first Adar, which is not really Adar, as I just got through saying. What's going on over here? How can he say that in the same breath? I've done this always myself, and I'm going to explain to you the reason. The Mahari while Shekosav Shemaharis Spirlei Zal or Shemari Sal, maybe this is Segel, maybe it's Mari Segel, I'm not sure. Hora Lisanos Bishneim. That the older poskim had said, after I paskin to only fast in the first Adar, they paskin to fast in both Adars. The Da'atorot Lomar Mahari Latsun Bisheni Midorma bin Adorim Hanoder Ad Adar Im Lo Yada Shahashana Mu'beres Adar Harishon. That if a person takes a neder and he says, I'm going to fast until Adar, and he doesn't realize that there are two Adars, so then he only has to fast until the first Adar. But if he knows that it's a leap year, then he has to fast until the second Adar. And if a guy knows, therefore, that there are leap years that come up regularly within the 19-year pattern, the 19-year cycle, so then logic would dictate that he has to reckon with both Adars, just like you have to do in Hilchos Nedarim. So that's why the Mahari Weil had paskin that you should fast in both Adars. But before I knew that, I had always paskin that you should fast in the first Adar. Now I'm going to explain to you why. He says, my Rebbe always used to paskin like the Mahari. However, let me tell you why I think you should only have to fast in the first Adar. He says, I'll tell you why. And again, you can see from the language that I'm skipping chunks. He says, "Desvara lomar dezeha minhag ba omishum debiyom shemespo abba o rabo isra mazole omishum kapara laaviv o rabo." Now he says, and this is really the essential component of the Mari Mintzis Svara. He says, why do we fast on the Yortzeit? There are two possible reasons that a person would fast on a Yortzeit. Reason number one, he says, is because the mazel of my father or my Rebbe was bad on that day, and that's why the person died. Because a person dies on a day when the mazel is bad. So in order to because I'm connected somehow to my father or to my Rebbe, I want to fast in order to save myself from getting that same mazel. Okay? That's one reason to fast on a Yortzeit. O mishum kapara la'aviv oravo. Another reason could be that you fast on the day of the Yortzeit of your father or your Rebbe is because it's acting like a Yom Kippur to atone for your father's sins or for your Rebbe's sins, to give them an aliyas neshama so that their soul can ascend farther up. Okay, that's the second reason to fast. Two reasons. One is because the mazel was bad for my father or my Rebbe on that day. The second reason is to give an aliyah for the neshama to act as a kapara. Good? So far good? Degamal Rabba.
It's for the mother as well, right?
Yes, of course. Degamal Rabba Omar Harini Kaparas Mishkavu Vromizaka Abba Velo Abba Bere. Because we know that this applies both to a father or to a Rebbe, and we know that a son gives merits to a father through his good deeds. And that's why you could argue that maybe the Yortzeit should be on the day of the burial. But no, we don't paskin that way. We paskin, with the exception of the first year, we paskin that the Yortzeit is always on the day of death, because the day of death is either the bad mazel or the day when the neshama goes to its next level. Because a person on the anniversary, the neshama on the anniversary of its death, gets judged and gets assigned to the next level, to the next shlav. V'chein pasak ha'aguda b'shvuos b'perak hanal v'omer bo kaddish kehu of the Rabbi Akiva. And it's also the time on the Yortzeit when you're supposed to say kaddish, like that story, the famous story about Rabbi Akiva, shalom ad berei dehu gavra lomar baruchu l'sefer Torah chadisa b'tana devei Eliyahu rabba katan ha'omer kaddish matzil aviv min ha'pur anos. The very famous medrash in Tana Devei Eliyahu. So I'll just speak it out very briefly. Rabbi Akiva says, one day I was walking through a forest and I saw a man who was carrying an inordinately large bundle of wood on his back. And I immediately knew that this man was not from this world. He was no longer among the living, because no one alive could possibly carry such a huge burden. So I knew that this was an apparition. I knew that this was an image being sent to me of a man who had already passed away. And I said to him, "Why are you doing this? What are you doing here?" He said to me, "This is my lot. I've been assigned to this punishment because I never taught my son Aleph Beis. I never taught him how to read Hebrew. I never taught him how to daven. I never taught him Torah." So Rabbi Akiva asked the guy's name. He went and he found the child. He teaches the child Aleph Beis. He teaches the child how to read. He teaches the child how to say Kaddish. And as soon as the child says Kaddish, the man comes to him in a dream and tells him that my son's Kaddish brought me to the Olam HaEmes, brought me to my final resting spot. So we see that that's the efficacy of saying Kaddish. Okay? But he says, when does the son have the greatest effect on his father's neshama or on his Rebbe's neshama? On the day, the anniversary of the father's passing. The kaven demi haitama nagu lihisanos, omitam kaporas aviv, omitam shnehem, either to atone for your father or because of bad mazel, usvara lomar demisha meis aviv o ima o rabo ba'adar b'shana pshuta b'shana shachnera ibor posek milomar kaddish b'shvat. He says, it would make sense to me that if a person's mother or father died in a regular Adar, and the next following year is a leap year, then you should stop saying Kaddish in Shabbat, because you only say Kaddish for 11 months, as we know. Fine. We talked about the halacha of saying Kaddish for 11 months in a previous year. We're not going to revisit that. However, now he says, I want to tell you where we know that the judgment of Rishayim is 12 months. We know that the judgment of a Rasha is 12 months in Gehenna. Where do we know this from? We know this from a Mishnah in Maseches Idios. And I'm presenting you now, here says the Mari Mintz, the Mishnah in Maseches Idios. I'm just in the brackets, I just have the part of the Mishnah that the Mari Mintz assumed that we all knew. Apu haya omer, this Tana used to say, Chamisha dvarim shel shnei masar chodesh. There are 5 halachas, or 5 phenomena in Jewish thought that revolve around 12 months. And what are they? Mishpat dor hamabul shnei masar chodesh, that the people of the dor hamabul were judged for 12 months. Mishpat Iyov shnei masar chodesh. Iyov was punished for 12 months. For I guess his earthly punishment, his ordeals, lasted for 12 months. Mishpat Hamitzriyim Shnei Masar Chodesh. The Egyptians and the plagues were punished for 12 months. Mishpat Gog Magog La'asid Lavo Shnei Masar Chodesh. The Gog Magog war will last for 12 months. And Mishpat Rishayim B'Gehenim Shnei Masar Chodesh. And the judgment of the wicked in Gehenim is for 12 months. Shenemar V'Haya Midei Chodesh B'Chodesho. And the Mishnah quotes a pasuk in Yeshaya that says that it shall be from month to month. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, min ha-Pesach v'ad ha-Atzeres, shneimar midei chodesh Shabbos b'Shabbat. So we won't deal with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Shita. But we know, the Mari Mintz says, we bring this Mishnah in to teach me that the full judgment of a bad person, even the worst kind of person, even if a person's father was really a bad guy, his judgment will last a maximum of 12 months. Uperish mi idios ainly. So he says, I don't have a good explanation to this Mishnah. I'm trying to look at this Mishnah and trying to understand, where do you see in the pasuk in Yeshaya that the judgment of Rishayim is 12 months? V'hayami de chodesh b'chodesho. So he suggests as follows: Umistavra derot salomar min midei chodesh b'chodesho kadorish. The mishpat Rishayim midei chodesh shabo niftar mishpato ad shechozer oto chodesh. He says, it would seem to me that what we're bringing from this pasuk is that on the month that the person passed away, his judgment will continue until he comes back to that same month when the moon is back in the very same position, when it goes through 12 cycles and it goes back to where it was originally on the day that he died. Dahainu chodshei halevana, d'shayach lomar aleha chidush, ma shelo shayach al chodshei hachama, she'einena mitchadeshet be'atzma, aval holechet mimazal lemazal. Ve'etzel hamazal ikal chidush v'lo ba'atzmuta. So basically he's saying what changes on a monthly basis, what renews on a monthly basis. It's the lunar cycle, not the sun. And therefore when we talk about from one month to the next, we're referring to 12 lunar cycles where the moon is constantly dynamically changing, but it goes back to where it was 12 months after the previous cycle where it was in that exact same place, in that exact same position. He says, "V'yochol lihiyos shenikru chodshei hachama b'shituf Hashem, v'agav chodshei halavana sheish chidush b'atzmuta vo b'mikra lo nimtza." I'm not going to go through the whole thing. He says, "V'orach chodesh katav v'zeloshanu uminalan shalavana nikreit chodesh ditman mishar et hachodesh v'niyochol leilech b'raglav hakamoshanu." He's basically trying to demonstrate that the one astronomical body that changes on a monthly basis is the moon, and that's the criterion for determining 12 months. The imke, and therefore he wants to argue as follows. We're almost done with the tshuva from the Mari Mintz. I know it's quite lengthy. He says, "Misha niftar b'shana pshuta in this abra hashana achar kach." So therefore, let's think about it for a second. We're dealing with a 12-month period of judgment for a person after he dies. A person dies in a regular year. The following year is a leap year. So when is his judgment finished? His judgment, if he dies in an ADAR, his judgment will be finished in ADAR Rishon. It's a 12-month period of judgment. He says, "Umishpato ba'adar harishon v'im kain sham shayach hata'anit v'hakadish v'chein b'chol shana v'shana." That's the day which is worthy of revisiting, because that's the day which revisits the day of the father's or Rebbe's death. Because that's the time when the 12-month judgment is concluded. So the Mari Mintz says it may not be really Adar. It may be an imposter Adar. But when we go according to the criteria of when is the 12-month judgment concluded, how do I now atone and get my father to the next level? So you got to go according to 12 months, not according to the month anniversary. Okay. So he says, I'm not sure. Okay, because of constraints on time, I think I'm going to stop the tshuva here. I encourage you to see the rest of the tshuva on your own. But that's what, we'll just read maybe another few lines. He says, "Ve'ein lomar klal de'ashnei adorin chashuvin gam lazeh kechodesh echad ledino umishpato chalila." He says, you can't tell me that both adars are considered one long 60-day month, and that the father is going to be judged an extra month. He says, "Ki la'avos adam berivo Hashem lo tziva." Quotes a pasuk. God is not here to get into a fight. Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba bitruna in briosiv is what Chazal say. God's not here to make things more difficult for His creations. Why would Hashem do that? Why would Hashem say that just because your 12-month period coincides with a leap year, that your judgment is going to be an extra month? That's not fair. V'lacheni mishum kaparahu lama ya'acher kaparas avivo rabo v'lovo yavi kaparasam b'yom kalos mishpatam dahainu b'yom taharasam b'yom achar kalos dinam u'mishpatam achar kalos yud beis chodshei levana. So he says, if you're interested in giving a kapara to your father, do it immediately after he's gone through that cycle of judgment, which is 12 months later. V'im mishum demisra mazalei b'yom hahu b'yom shemeis bo aviv. He says, and if it's because of it's the day when the mazel is bad, mikol makom aporgav debal puranus bar minan. Okay, he says, and you should still do it, even though you're doing something that is unpleasant earlier. And he goes through the whole discussion. Let's summarize. The real Adar is Adar Sheni. So when it comes to a bar mitzvah boy, we want to know halachically when is he a mature adult. Second Adar. When we want to observe Yartzeit, that's dependent upon the 12-month judgment of a person's parent or Rebbe. And therefore, if there's a leap year the next year, then the Yartzeit will be an Adar Rishon. And the same thing will be true for all future leap years, which commemorates the time when my father goes to the next level, which was the 12-month period after his death. That was the first ascent. And every year I have to commemorate that ascent from harsh judgment to the next level of greatness that my father or my Rebbe can accomplish in Shemayim. There's just one small problem with this Maharimitz. One tiny little problem. And it's a problem that I didn't think of on my own. I kicked myself in the head. I should have thought of this problem. It's quite obvious. Can anyone think of there's just one small problem with this Maharimitz? According to the argument that he's making, that the yahrzeit has to be observed 12 months after the Petira.
We're short days.
Next year it's in Shvat.
Excellent, Dr. Kirshen. Let's say this year, okay, a person is nifter in Adar Rishon. So there, let's say a person is nifter on Yud Gimel Adar Rishon. So when should the judgment of their neshama conclude? On Yud Gimel Shvat. That's 12 months later. So we should establish that the perpetual yahrzeit of that person is Yud Gimel Shvat and not Yud Gimel Adar. Now, is that the halacha? No, that's not the halacha. Nowhere do we find anyone saying that. No one even suggests that. So how did I discover this?
This isn't the first year the dean, and then after that it's just yahrzeit bo bayom.
Bo bayom, but the Marimintz's chiddush is that it's the yahrzeit is a commemoration of the 12 months after the death, which commemorates the coming out of that judgment of Gehenna.
Correct. So the first year is about Din, and then forward is about the day of yahrzeit.
But what is yahrzeit? Marimit says the day of yahrzeit means the 12-month anniversary. That's what the definition of the day of yahrzeit. So, if a parent died in the first Adar and the following year is a regular year, so then the yahrzeit should be perpetually on Shvat, not in the first Adar. Count 12 months. Okay, so he dies in Adar Rishon, Adar Sheni, Nisan,
but then they
Iyar,
actually change every year.
Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Shvat, Teves, and Shvat. That's 12 months.
Every year there's a leap year, which changes another month.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'd be like a Muslim.
No, but you'd only have to commemorate it based on the first 12-month anniversary. The Mariya Mitzvah's Chiddush is the first 12-month anniversary is the yahrzeit date. That's what established, because that's when the judgment of the parent of the Rebbe concludes. That establishes in stone the date of the yahrzeit. So the truth of the matter is, this is not my question. This is the question of the Chassam Sofer. So take a look in the last page of your handout. By the way, there are two other topics that I wanted to discuss with you tonight that we won't be able to get to tonight. I'll just touch on them briefly so that maybe if you want, if you're interested, we'll do them next time. First issue is, when do we observe the yahrzeit of Moshe Rabbeinu, Zayin Adar? Okay? First or second Adar? And why should that be, Mr. Steinfeld?
Purim is in the second month, so it's the real Adar. The first month is the...
But we just got through saying that you observe yahrzeit in the first month.
Yeah, but I think that's anyway the reason.
Well, that's the important thing. We don't say that in either one.
Yeah.
Perhaps one of the reasons why they separate them is because Mishneh Nasara and Rabbi Simcha, the second month is the real Adar, then you want to try and keep the lesser Simcha in the first Adar, which is the fake Adar.
Okay, so that's the first question that I'd like to discuss with you next time. And the second question that I want to discuss with you is, what if a person dies on the 30th of Adar Rishon? When's the yahrzeit the following year? There is no 30th of Adar.
All right, great.
February 29th.
It's like February 29th. So do you get like a free pass? You could just have to wait till the next leap year?
No.
For a birthday, it's a bummer because there's no gift, right?
No. What date was he buried? You said the first year. What date was he buried?
Okay, granted. Okay, but what is the yahrzeit? What is the yahrzeit? Okay, so this, by the way, is also a common question that I get once about every 5 years, because it does come up. Okay? So, and this is discussed in the poskim as well. And it's a machlokas ha-poskim, so maybe we'll deal with that next time. But take a look. The Moedim Uzmanim Rav Sternbach Shlita has a tshuva about Tainus Yortzeit B'din Bar Mitzvah Ba'adar Rishon Osheni. I was a little surprised. Nowhere in this tshuva does he quote the Mahari Mintz. He goes immediately to the Chasam Sofer, which is several centuries after the Mahari Mintz. It could be he didn't have access to the Sefer. I don't know. I have the CD-ROM, so it's easy for me to be a big talker. But the Rav Sternbuch writes this decades ago when there was no CDs. So maybe this was what he had accessible to him. But he writes in the top of the last page of your handout. He says, Umatsasi, basically his question is, why is it that the Ramah paskins that a yortzeit is observed in the first Adar and a bar mitzvah is observed in the second Adar? So he writes as follows. He says, Umatsasi b'shut chasam soifer shebi'er, who explains as follows, Dili inyan tainis yortzeit hine amru chazal demishpat rishoim beganim yud beis chodesh. Im kein talui b'yud beis chodesh v'lo b'shana. So he gives the same teretz as the Mahari Mintz, that the judgment, which is what the yortzeit is supposed to commemorate, is the 12-month judgment of a parent, is 12 months, not a year. Bless you, so it's got nothing to do with the leap year. Heaven cannot wait. Heaven won't wait, right? Wasn't there a movie like that? Heaven can wait. All right. Heaven won't wait, is what the Chasam Sofer is saying. Heaven's not going to delay taking this guy out of Gehenna because it's an Ibr Shana. Okay? That's essentially what the Mahari Mintz and the Chasam Sofer are saying. V'lochei nikva kfar l'chol hashonim sheyehei hayortzeit ba'adar rishon. Now then he writes like this. He says, Aval kfar hirgish ba'atzmo. But then the Chasam Sofer chaps himself. He says, Shelafize, according to this argument, Imes ba'adar rishon, v'nishlamulo yud beis chodesh l'shana haba b'shvat, and then the 12 months are over the following year in the month of Shvat, nema shahayortzeit yachul tamid b'shvat. Then he should have a perpetual yortzeit in Shvat, not in Adar. So the Chasam Sofer, this is Rav Sternbuch quoting the Chasam Sofer. He says, "V'nidchak dishma garim." He says you have to say that it's the name of the month of Adar that is also a contributing criterion for the yortzeit to be established. V'hainu shemei Adar la'Adar makdimin mehaytaima avalo mechodesh lechodesh. He says you can go and do a month earlier to commemorate the 12 days of judgment, but from one month that's not Adar from the Adar to do it 1 month earlier to a month that's not Adar, that you cannot do. And Rav Sternbuch says v'doichak. He says that I'm not happy with that. He's not happy with that, and the only thing that I have to add to this is that really, when we look back at the language of the Mahari Mintz, we discover that what he has essentially said is that heaven will conform to certain things. Heaven will conform to the Beis Din's declaration of Adar. But heaven will only conform so much. So it's almost like the Mahari Mintz was equivocating. Heaven will conform in other words, Hashem will alter a person's biology to conform to 2 Adars. So you won't be physiologically bar mitzvah until the second Adar. But heaven will not extend a person's punishment if his Gehenna falls out in a leap year. Which the question that you have to ask is, if God's willing to change the rules of nature to conform to Beis Din, why isn't God prepared to stretch the laws of Gehenna? So you have to say that there's a certain elasticity, but not completely. Hashem will extend a person's judgment in Gehenna only if it's Adar. From one Adar to the next, Hashem will have to stretch that person's judgment. So if he dies in Adar Rishon, then the judgment will perhaps continue until the following Adar for a 13th month. But it won't stretch it if it's going to end up in another month that's not Adar. But in any event, I just will conclude with this. Rav Sternbuch comes up with a number of maskanas that you can go through in the tshuva, but he says, Va'achshav puk chazi, it's on the very bottom of the page below that, the line that I have there on the sheet. Let's go over some new halachas that we can derive from what I've just said. Number one, le'inyan bar mitzvah, b'shana me'uberes ha'ikar ba'adar sheni. When it comes to a bar mitzvah that falls out in a leap year, we know you go according to the second Adar. V'im nolad ba'adar rishon, ha'ikar shenaseh bar mitzvah ba'adar rishon. He says, and if the bar mitzvah falls out in the first Adar and the kid was born in the first Adar, so his bar mitzvah is in the first Adar. Umiyu gam b'nolad b'shana pshuta kedai lahachmir sheyaniach tefillin v'yizar b'mitzvahs kfar ba'adar rishon. He says, however, l'chumra, a child should consider himself bar mitzvah in the first Adar as well. So therefore, make sure that kid is already wearing tefillin, perhaps even a month before Adar Rishon, for practice, and make sure that he conducts himself like, let's say, for Tainus Esther. Well, there is no Tainus Esther on Adar Rishon. There is no fasting on Adar Rishon. But for all other mitzvahs, for all intensive purposes, he should consider himself chayiv in mitzvahs l'chumra in Adar Rishon. No, that would be a kula, because that would be a question of kavod hatzibur also. Le'inyan yard site ha'ikar lomar kaddish barishon she'en yom adin v'aliyas neshama pa'amayim, because there's no judgment a second time. U'mistaver shegam legra hadin came delo ma'akven aliyas nishmaso ad l'sheni u'miu roi lahachmir gam b'sheni kebarishon kisheinu doche chiyuv. He says, however, you should be machmir in the second Adar also to say kaddish and to daven, where you're not superseding or pushing off or displacing someone who has a real chiyuv. The lo shayach hagdama v'yichor b'zman din shamayim kevin sheba shamayim eino inyan zman klal. The raklanu nikva lefi azman v'chayev linog din Torah ulididan adar sheni hu adar v'rishon hosaf and ken a yard site b'sheni. So he wants to argue something very fascinating. He says there is no before or after in heaven. There's no time in heaven. He says time is only established for us, and we have to comport our lives according to halacha that's based in time. And therefore, because for us the second Adar is really Adar and the first Adar is really just an added month, so therefore he wants to argue that the yard site is arguably in the second month as well. Because what is 12 months? What is 13 months in heaven, in Gehenna? So he's being very existential and philosophical over here. And therefore he wants to argue that on that basis you should try to say Kaddish in the second Adar as well. But certainly we paskin in the first Adar for sure. Le'inyan soma yard site l'das ha'machaber toli ba'adar sheni u'larama b'rishon ikar. So he says fasting on the yard site, the machaber says it's Adar sheni, the Ramah says it's the first Adar, and some say that you should do both Adars. Ulagra midina tzrichim latzum b'teravai. The Gra paskins al pi ikar hadin, you have to fast in both. V'cheinu lefi hasvara de'isra hamazal ba'osa yom b'chodesh adar dika haisvara b'teravai v'alkei nira deroi shiyamru kaddish v'yarbu b'mitzvah sumasim tovim gam ba'adar sheni. He reinforces the Gra shita that you should say Kaddish in both months, you should give tzedakah in both months, because there's bad mazel on both days, on both Adars. Okay. Maybe we'll continue next week with the next part of this. There's two other issues that we discussed. Have a good night.